Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to continue on with our discussion of anxiety disorders, and what I was going to talk about is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a kind of anxiety disorder. But I decided to really do it justice, I need to first talk about trauma, and that's certainly worth a video. Actually, you can do a whole series, actually probably a whole channel dedicated to just trauma itself, and I'll try and compact everything down into like a 15 or 20 minute video or so. Again, trauma is, I'm not really a trauma counselor in the sense that I'm not trained in any real techniques. The biggest one being EMDR. That's sort of like, I don't know if it's like the best method, but it's sort of the new hot thing right now as far as treating trauma goes. With a lot of studies that shows it's effective to some degree. But again, it's sort of like what I talked about with grief, is if you're a counselor, there's three things that you just have to be familiar with. Grief is one of them, trauma is another one, and then substance abuse is another one. And so, yeah, it comes up a lot. And really when I talk about this, you'll understand why pretty much every counselor needs to know about trauma. Because what trauma is, as best as I can kind of sum it up and simplified, is trauma is some event that happened in your past that had a significant negative impact, so much so that it is still impacting who you are today, your present. So trauma is something that happened in the past. Could have happened yesterday, could have happened 10 years ago, it could have happened when you were 2 years old, could have even happened in infancy, or some people even talk about pre-birth when mom is still pregnant with you. But that sort of trauma has had enough of a significant impact on your life that's still impacting things today. We've all had bad things happen in our lives, but most of the time we shake it off without really having any impact. And these were things that were traumatic in our lives. And that's really simplified what it is. You don't need to get into different categories of trauma in that sense. And that's why a lot of my clients, when they talk about how they are today, a lot of it ties back to something that happened to them in the past. And they don't necessarily think of themselves as being traumatized, or they will say, like, I don't have nothing ever bad happened to me in my life. I wasn't like sexually abused, or wasn't beaten or anything else like that. And I'm like, there's a whole category, a whole bunch of other things that can count as trauma. And I kind of break them down into like capital T and little t trauma, capital T trauma, little t trauma, mainly just to kind of help people wrap their heads around. Like capital T trauma is stuff that most of us would acknowledge as trauma, being abused as a child, severe neglect as a child, a violent crime, being mugged, being assaulted, sexually assaulted or not, these sort of things. This is the sort of stuff that most people will wrap. Oh yeah, that's traumatic. They get that. People have gone through war. PTSD was originally ascribed to war veterans, and then they realized that people of a variety of backgrounds exhibited the same kind of traits as war veterans without ever having been in war, and that's when they kind of realized, oh, this PTSD thing is a thing. I'll talk more about that in the next video. But what I like to call lowercase t trauma is stuff that's still impactful, but not what most people would think of as traumatic. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. It's a big military town, and at the time I didn't realize it, but now that I've known more people, adults who were children, basically army brats, that constant moving around was trauma as well. Dad was never deployed, or mom, I guess, if she was in the military, but the parent was never deployed. They weren't in a war zone. There was no fear that, oh, well, someday dad may just not come home because he died in a war. But just that constant moving around every year or two, having to pick up, move schools, make new friends, get used to a new school, get used to a new location, that's kind of traumatic for kids. And that has an impact growing up in life. Being raised by an alcoholic parent, that's also its own kind of trauma. Having an emotionally distant parent is also traumatic. Having an overly involved parent, borderline kind of parent, that's also its own kind of trauma. And that kind of gets into the next thing with trauma as well, is there are single acute cases and sort of like long-term chronic cases. A single acute case could be like a criminal act. You're out and you're having fun, and someone sticks a gun in their face and says, "Give me all your money." That's a single event, trauma. It's a violent crime. It's terrifying. Sexual assault, same sort of thing. The really bad car accident could also be. These are all single events that. One of the reasons why they're traumatic is, one, there's just always the fear this is life or death. And then also it's because it's so outside the norm of these people's lives. These people may have come from happy, healthy, stable homes. They're in loving, supportive relationships. Everything about their life is good until this incident comes along. And a lot of times that is also can be traumatic as well. And then there's the more like the long-term chronic sort of thing. Children who are raised by addicted parents, substance abuse addicted parents, where there's chronic long-term sexual abuse, particularly if it's like incestuous, because you can never escape your abuser at that point, right? Living in a war zone, it's not just a single violent act. It's just this constant in the background. When's it going to start again? When's the violence going to start again? What's the next bad thing that's going to happen in my life? These two things have very different sort of traits. EMDR, for instance, is very, very effective in helping people overcome those single incident traumas. I've been told that it can help people with the chronic trauma, but it requires a little difference. Like, you kind of want to go find a therapist that specializes in that kind of traumatic incidents, because it's just different. It has a different impact on the brain. Someone who comes from a loving, supportive, stable home life with lots of good, solid relationships can handle that single incident trauma a lot better than someone who has an unstable home life and all of that sort of thing. Because they're basically all the wiring in their brain that tells them you're safe and you're loved and you're cared for and you're supported and you can handle things, all that stuff is laid down, and so when horrible thing happens, they can handle that. And we've noticed this with veterans, for instance. Suicide rates are astronomical with veterans, and they keep going up, it seems. And one of the things that they've noticed with a study that I thought was interesting was that most of the veterans who commit suicide were never deployed. These are not guys necessarily who are dealing with the horrors of war or horrors of combat. Many of them haven't even left the United States, and yet they're still committing suicide. And I think what they've noticed is these are people who came from abusive backgrounds. They came from a life where there's already this sort of daily, chronic, long-term trauma, and then they go into the military, and something, I don't think we even really know what, but something triggers their suicidality. I have some guesses, but I think it'd be very different for each person. But that's to kind of show that, there's this difference. And when we talk about trauma, we also have to talk about resiliency, because that's something we don't talk enough about. There's actually some studies have shown that trauma counseling makes things worse. And I think it kind of depends on the kind of trauma counseling you do, but certainly about the philosophy of the counselors involved as well. That, I want to say most, a lot of the trauma counselors that I've met, they tend to forget that there's this notion of resiliency, that some people just aren't bothered. We don't really know why. It may be that they came from a really great, stable household, and so when the bad thing happens, they can deal with it better. Maybe it's just a personality trait, but there are some people who just aren't that bothered by things that happen to them in their lives. What we would consider horribly traumatic, they consider like, oh, that kind of sucked, but and that's sort of the next thing is like, what do you do with the trauma? Because it's not always the event that tells you this is traumatic. It is the person's response to the event. You got 3 guys who are all in the same squad in the Army. They're all deployed to the same zone. They're all in the same firefight. It's horrible. People get killed. It's bad. Things go sideways. And these 3 guys all experience the exact same incident at the exact same time. One of them, is just destroyed for life. Drug addiction, horrible PTSD. We'll talk more about all the symptoms that go with that. But homelessness, disconnect from all his family. That incident just haunts this person. In their dreams, their nightmares, and all sort of thing. Another person, it flips a switch, and then they become a better person. Now they get out of it, and they want to help people from that point on. They become, a minister or some sort of, crisis volunteer. They try and help people after that. The incident actually made them a better person. And then there's someone else who, if you ask them about it, they're like, yeah, that sucked, but, I didn't die. And that's it. It doesn't seem to faze them. And so that's another aspect with trauma, too, it's far too easy for a lot of people, a lot of counselors, unfortunately, to jump in and say, oh, that was horrible, that was trauma, that was this early. If there's no evidence that it had a significant negative impact on their life, then we, counselors, can't call it trauma, So how does all this play out in fiction? Well, with at the heart of all fiction is conflict, right? Our characters have to go through a bad situation and then come out the other side. Well, that bad situation could be traumatic, and it kind of depends on how you want to go with it. For instance, in Saga of the Scout, it's basically about Ethan, who is a teenage Boy Scout. He's about 15. He's not even old enough to drive. And he experiences a third of the world going insane, and people start killing each other. His father gets shot in the head. This is all like in chapter 1, so I'm not giving anything away. His sister becomes overly violent. She falls into the insanity too. She starts killing people. I don't write that as trauma, mainly because I don't want to. That wasn't the story that I wanted to tell. You could go down that road and certainly say Ethan was traumatized and he should have nightmares and he should have all these other issues. But one, that's not the story that I really wanted to tell. Maybe I'll visit it in later books or something like that. But you don't have to drive home the trauma of your characters. That said, these traumatic incidences need to transform your character. The Ethan that you see in chapter 1 of Saga of the Scout is not the same Ethan you're going to see at the end of the book, because all these events, all these traumatic events, change him. And that is something I do see a lot of people in fiction do wrong, is they heap lots of problems onto their characters, which is good. That kind of drives the plot and develops the characters. But then they don't develop the characters. The person goes through this horrible event, and then in the next chapter, it's not even mentioned or anything. Comic books have this problem a lot too, and apparently there was a comic book, I think it was in the DC universe, where they had a psychiatric ward or something that superheroes could go to, and it would sort of wipe their memory, so they didn't really remember all the traumatic incidences. Or something along those lines. I don't really read DC, but someone was telling me about it. But so you can make it about addressing that issue, but you don't really have to. But the trauma does need to. I guess it's another way of saying it. If it doesn't affect the character, then it's not trauma, because it's not changing them. It's not having an impact on the character as we go through the story. If you want it to have an impact, then it's trauma. But a lot of people just say, oh, I'm going to have my character go through this bad thing because I read in a book someplace that characters should be, you should heap lots of troubles on your characters. That makes an interesting story. But what's interesting is how the characters overcome those negative instances and in how they change afterwards. If you don't do the change afterwards, you haven't really done trauma. You've just written about horrible incidences one after another and then just kind of moved on that way. And then again, I think with the trauma is remembering that trauma is not necessarily physical. It can be psychological. Like I said, just being raised by an emotionally distant parent or a psychologically abusive parent can be traumatic. Everything else in the person's life could be perfect, and we hear about this all the time. Rich kids growing up in rich environments with all the money in the world, they have no needs that won't be met, and they're still massively unhappy. And a lot of times it's because their parents are basically just shitty parents, and they'd be shitty parents even if they weren't multimillionaires. It doesn't matter. So it is not necessarily just about the physical events. It's also the psychological events. So it also needs to be about what's going on in the characters. That's something that's really great about fiction, about writing books, is that we can really get into the characters' heads and feelings and kind of express it in a way that really movie and TV, they can't do that in the same way. But anyway, so yeah, in the next video I'll talk about PTSD, talk about the much more acute ways in which trauma affects us, and then how you can kind of represent that in fiction as well. But if you have any other ideas for mental health issues or just video ideas you'd like to see me talk about, put it in the comments and I'll put it in the list. I'll talk to you later. Bye.